Hello and welcome to the final Literacy Ready training refresher for English Unit 1, Lesson 8. This training refresher focuses on providing feedback and encouraging revision for students who are working from their rough draft of the synthesis essay and aiming for their final draft. So students will typically receive two kinds of feedback on their rough draft and presentation. The first kind of feedback is peer feedback. And in this case, this is feedback from other students in the class. They should receive copies of the feedback on their presentation. This feedback was completed in Lesson 7, and students should be given all the feedback that their peers provided on their presentation. Ultimately, in Lesson 8, all of the students will be involved in some peer editing sessions, which is a different form of feedback, but also something quite useful. The second type of feedback that students will receive will be teacher feedback. And this will really consist of several different types of feedback. The first is some written comments on the draft. So they've given you a rough draft of their synthesis essay, and you're going to provide some written comments on their draft. The second type of teacher feedback they're going to receive is through one-on-one conferring. And this is an opportunity for you to sit down and talk to students in a one-on-one setting to look at their draft and really talk through what do they need to do to revise it for the final. The third type of feedback will really be whole class, and that is in the form of mini lessons. And we're going to talk through what those mini lessons might look like in this training refresher. So now I'd like to go back to the idea of providing written comments on students' drafts and just to provide some suggestions for the best way to do that and the way to do it so that students will be able to take up what you've written. There's a lot of research that talks about teacher response to student writing, and what we know from that is that if you go through and correct every usage problem, every non-standard English, every punctuation problem, there's little chance of that actually influencing students taking up those corrections and implementing them in the future. So, my suggestions for providing feedback on students' drafts are two. When you're writing on their drafts, first of all, you want to minimize edits and corrections. This does not mean that you completely ignore those edits and corrections, but instead what you write on their draft includes more holistic suggestions for structure, paragraphing, and sequencing. Now, those holistic suggestions for structure, paragraphing, and sequencing should be a result of reading the whole paper. So you read the whole draft and you see that students are, for example, having difficulty with paragraphing. Maybe they've written one big paragraph and the whole thing is, the whole essay is one paragraph without any paragraph separations. So you might provide some suggestions about how students divide their paper into paragraphs. Even at the paragraph level, you might notice that students are having trouble sequencing the sentences in their paragraphs, and what comes out is really unstructured and doesn't flow well. So you might provide some advice about how to structure sentences within a paragraph. And similarly, if you notice that they're having difficulty with sentence structure itself, you might pick out a few things and give them some feedback on that. Now, as you notice the kinds of usage, spelling, punctuation, grammatical problems that students are having, it's really important to make note of that on your own. So you might note them on the paper. For example, you might say, I noticed that you're having a good bit of trouble with subject-verb agreement. Let's talk about that in a one-on-one setting, or I'll be providing a mini lesson on that, etc. So the key here is noticing the kinds of problems that students are having trouble with so that you can confer with them one-on-one and talk through those problems, or so that you can provide a mini lesson to the whole class if the whole class is struggling with that same problem. It's a slightly different way of providing feedback than has traditionally been the role of the English teacher, But even so, I think it may be ultimately more impactful on students' writing and how they take up your suggestions. So a second way we're talking about teachers providing feedback is through one-on-one conferring. So this would be maybe a 10-minute session where you sit down with one student while the rest of the class is revising or having a peer editing conference or something like that, and talk them through some of the problems that they are individually experiencing in their draft. So it's important that you reserve this one-on-one conferring for students who are experiencing unique problems or for students experiencing overwhelming problems with writing. So let's talk first about these unique problems. So this is the student who's having some kind of writing problem that really isn't present in the rest of the class's work. So instead of providing a mini lesson for the whole class, you would meet one-on-one with that student to deal with the particular unique problem he or she is having. Now, for the student who's having overwhelming problems, this is a good opportunity for a one-on-one conference as well. The trick here is not to continue to overwhelm them, but to focus perhaps on the biggest problems that they're experiencing first. So let's say they have a whole lot of spelling problems, a whole lot of punctuation problems, and a whole lot of paragraphing problems. Perhaps starting with just the paragraphing problems would help them to revise their paper, and then through the peer editing process and an additional conference later, you might address the other two problems that they're having. So this one-on-one conferring is really an opportunity for you to sit down with a student side by side, take a look at their paper, and talk through the kinds of revisions they may need to make. In either of these two cases, you want to focus the conference on specific issues and on modeling. So you providing modeling of what a better way of writing would look like. This is very time consuming, but we do know that when we sit down and talk with students about their writing, it has greater potential to make a change from the rough draft to the final draft than if we just correct papers and give them back. A final way that you might provide feedback for your students is through mini lessons. So this is the result of having read their rough drafts, seen the kinds of problems that the class as a whole is having, and then developing short, focused lessons on those common issues. So your mini lesson may be anywhere from 8 to 10 minutes, just clearly presenting information that they need to know about whatever the problem is they're having. And then you follow up this sort of directed mini lesson with opportunities to practice and apply what you've taught them to the drafts of their essays. So for example, if students are having difficulty with using quotation marks correctly, perhaps they are not using quotation marks at all, or they're using punctuation with quotation marks incorrectly, something like that. You might provide a mini lesson where you present the correct way to do that, and then ask them to read through the draft and make corrections, and then maybe have one or two of them present the correction that they've made to the whole class. So you get a little bit of direct instruction, a little bit of practice, and a little bit of sharing out to the whole class. So these mini lessons actually have great potential for students to be able to use the information that you're providing directly on the draft that they've written. So it's a sort of on-demand, perfect timing kind of instruction that you can present to students to help them improve their writing from the rough draft to the final draft. Once you have finished with providing peer feedback and providing teacher feedback through written comments on the draft, one-on-one conferring, and mini lessons, then it's really time for students to apply the feedback to the revision and editing of their draft for the final draft. So you're going to ask students to take some time, review the feedback they've received, and apply it to their own writing. You will also probably need to clarify for students the difference between revision and editing. So editing would be those surface level kinds of changes, like, as I mentioned before, using quotation marks correctly, correcting spelling, correcting usage problems. That's editing. Revision is more of a structural overhaul of the paper itself. So maybe through the peer feedback, they received some comments that said that their evidence was not really very convincing, or that it didn't really match their thesis statement. So in that case, there's some revision that's needed. They need to go and find additional evidence that actually works well, and then put it into their paper. So it's important that you model both revision and editing for students. There are lots of opportunities in this unit for you to do that kind of work. Here at the end is also a good opportunity for you to just help students understand this by perhaps taking a draft from a student, or your own draft if you're writing with your students, and model how you would revise it based on feedback and how you would edit it. Then you might also want to model providing verbal feedback on a draft, so that students are not thinking that verbal feedback really just means, yes, excellent work, or this sucks, something like that. So instead, you might want to have some kind of a fishbowl opportunity where you and a volunteer student are sitting in the middle, and the rest of the class is sitting in a circle around you, and you model how you would provide verbal feedback. And the way to do that really is to sit down with a student, ask them, what is it that you'd like for me to look at, particularly when I'm reading through your paper, and then read the paper out loud, stopping occasionally to say, wow, that sentence didn't really make sense to me, or, I think this evidence that you have is really convincing, something like that. So you need to model the kind of feedback that you want students to provide for each other. After that modeling happens, then you would ask students to work with a partner to do a peer edit and to provide suggestions for revision. Students will revise, edit their papers, and turn in the final drafts, and then you will evaluate them using the rubric that we've provided.